The old debate, should you parry with the edge of a sword or with the flat? I'm going to give you a simple, straightforward answer. Are you ready? It fucking depends. This has been the subject of many heated debates, which I've also partaken in the past on both sides of the argument. And there are many good points to be made in favor of avoiding direct edge-on-edge contact. But it bothers me whenever people claim that the edge was never ever used in a defensive action. Alright, so first I'll discuss some historical evidence and then I'll show practical aspects of sword fighting mechanics to illustrate points. First off, it can be difficult to identify battle damage on archaeological finds with certainty. You have to distinguish them from damage that happened after the deposit. So damage from corrosion or from improper excavation and later handling, etc. If you look at these examples, you can see how it might be difficult to distinguish battle damage from corrosion damage, as these are not very well preserved. Also, not every preserved sword was actually used in battle, and in some cases you may not be able to see signs of repair. For example, look at this bow and bear here made by Quinn Waterfield. Would you be able to tell that this had extensive edge damage and was then repaired? This is what it looked like after I did the abusive testing. So this was pretty bad. You wouldn't really be able to tell that this has been repaired. In some cases, we might even be looking at blade shapes that were originally different from what you now have. There are, however, much more clear-cut examples, no pun intended. Like, for example, on this Dane axe here, you have massive notches that very obviously are a result of edge-on-edge contact. Also on this complex hilt sword here, you have notches on the strong of the blade that come from parrying with it. There's an interesting article published in the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory in 2020, which I'll link down below, that examines Bronze Age swords. They tested replicas made by Neil Burridge, by the way, and compared them to what they saw on original finds. They found different types of edge damage, some of which results from impacts against a spear shaft or the socket of a spear, some against a shield, some against another blade. And overall, they found evidence of blade damage that results from deliberately seeking blade contact. And that is in spite of the fact that they were used in conjunction with shields. Because sometimes the argument is made, if you use a shield, you don't want any contact between the swords. But in fact, there are good reasons for why you do want to. I'll get back to that later. If you look at the historical manuscripts that deal with sword fighting, the German sources in particular have a concept called versetzen, which is displacement. The problem with that is it has several different meanings. Displacement can either mean a passive defense, you either statically block to stop it or perform a deflectional parry to redirect it. The other meaning of displacement is an active defense, where you strike it aside and break the attack with a counter hue. Displacements are sometimes explicitly discouraged in the manuscripts, although Joachim Meyer's interpretation of Lichtenauer's advice to not parry is not quite so strict. Now, I haven't found any mention of blade damage in the manuscripts. I'm not aware of any instance where they explicitly tell you do not use the edge for displacement to not damage your blade or anything like that. The point generally of discouraging displacement is that you don't want to be the one who ends up simply defending. You want to force your opponent to do nothing but displace in a passive way, because then they don't threaten you. If you're not threatened, you can just keep pushing the offense and eventually you'll win. If you think about it, even if it's considered ideal to not perform static blocks or other passive displacements, they might happen anyway if your goal is to put the opponent in a position where that's the only option. If we look at active displacements, on the other hand, which by the way are not discouraged, they rely on stopping or redirecting the blade by cutting into it. Now this happens with the blades not contacting each other perpendicular. So not like this, but rather at an angle. So it could be like this, where it's partially on the edge, partially on the flat. That's a lot less destructive to the blade, but it will still cause edge damage. Make no mistake about it. The manuscripts often don't specify whether or not you should perform a displacement with the edge of the flat. It just says displace it. But there are some instances where it is indeed very clear. For example, Meyer talks about displacing with the long edge. And keep in mind, in the same source, it also tells you to set this aside with the flat of your sword. The Glasgow Fechtbuch tells us to displace a hew to the head with a messer with the long edge above. So that is clearly an edge parry. Di Grassi also mentions an edge parry. Talhofer, while describing combat on horseback, actually shows both. There's one picture that clearly shows an edge parry and another one that very obviously shows the flat being used. When fighting with messers, you see explicit flat parries, and here the nagel or nail guard comes in handy, because if I catch a blade on the flat and it slides down, the nail is what catches it. In fact, that allows techniques like defending against a cut with a thrust. But there are also unambiguous cases when you're told to put the spine of your blade against your arm and parry this way so you can then go ahead and grapple the opponent's arm. You can only do that with the edge if you're supposed to put the spine against your arm. If it had told you to put the flat against your arm, and you could still do this, you can still perform the same thing with the flat basically. The difference is if you do it with a flat, it's going to slide off. If you do it with the edge, it's going to bite into your edge. And that may very well be the point here, because now you've stopped that, you're controlling the opponent's blade, you make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Now you can grab and counter. And that can be quite useful. I recently ordered 2 short swords from Cult of Athena, which were on sale because they had blemishes, but they have very nice sharp edges. So we experimented a little bit with those for a demonstration. If you just push, I try to hold against it, he's already on point. So you would just have to thrust from here. If I do it with the edge, so let's again just push, this is much easier for me to hold against it. He's not on point. I can actually push it over here. Whereas as soon as I do this, my structure is weak. Of course, with a shorter blade, the dynamics are a little bit different. But one thing I can do is try to support this with the thumbs. A little bit awkward with the gauntlet here. I'm really trying now to defend myself, all right? It wants to collapse. Now, if I catch it higher up here on the strong, I have a better chance. So here, but with this guard, of course, it's dubious. Now, if I do it this way, much easier. So do it again. This, I can actually stop, and now they bind. They bite into each other. Now I can actually move it over here and then release and counter. I cannot do that with the flat. And we can already see edge damage from this, unfortunately. If I do a false edge deflection, that's better for the blade. So if he comes in for a cut and I do this kind of defense, the blade is fine. So do it again. Boom, because this is what happens. If you watch, so hold it out. This is what happens. I hit his flat. So I don't actually go edge on, but I go edge versus flat. With the messer, for example, it has a nail guard. So if he strikes at me and I catch it on here, now it slides down, the nail catches it, now I can do something, right? So that's a different story. So he cuts at me from this side. If I want to move offline, catch it this, I want this to slide off. So I can counter at the same time. Whereas if I did it this way, it wouldn't happen. So if he cuts down and I want to, this, it's gonna stick. In fact, now I'm in trouble. So there are situations where you do need to use the flat because you're trying something else. You want a different effect. Now he has the heavier blade, which gives him an advantage in the bind. But even so, if we start out in a even position, so let's just do both flat. This is completely even. As soon as I use my edge against his flat, I have a structural advantage here. Whereas if I try that with the flat, he can easily hold against it. Now I engaged my edge. He didn't change his level of resistance, so really make sure to try to let me not move it at all. Okay, so I can't really do much. Now, as soon as I engage my edge, you see what happens? Immediately it pushes over. So this is just a stronger position. In the bind, this really makes a huge difference. If I try to push here, and he gets an overbind on this, just by subtly tilting his wrist basically, now I'm on point. I need to do something about this. Right? So he could just thrust now. And if he does, then I need to bring this over here. So, and this is again where the fact that the edges bind just makes a difference. This is what you don't really get with blunts, especially with synthetics, but also with blunt blades. They just slide all over the place. If both cut forward, which is pretty common with a variety of swords, to get a bind, guess what? They're going to be damaged.
And this is what you see in the sparring a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, the most recent
so, and you'll see quite a bit of damage here.
Right.
Which, yeah, it sucks. That is a lot of damage, even from just this. Not doing it even at 50% force. So you can imagine how much this would suffer from actual fighting. But, well, what can you do? You need to survive, and afterwards you can just regrind it and fix it that way. So over time, chances are the blade would become narrower. In some cases you might not see it. If they regrind the entire thing, you may not necessarily be able to see that the blade was originally wider. But I suspect that probably happened quite a bit. And of course, it also depends on the type of blade and the grind. This one here didn't take quite as much damage, because you see it's a little bit thicker toward the edge. Even here, like on the flat, you can see it too. So damage to the blade in combat is just unavoidable. This is something that's easy to overlook, and personally I have to work on this a lot more as well. If you're fighting with sharp blades, in history, in a life or death situation, you want to do whatever you can to control the opponent's blade. Because if your opponent's sword is free to go wherever, there's a good chance that you may receive what's called an afterblow in HEMA tournament. Sounds harmless, but in real life it means you get crippled or killed as well. And working edge on edge in the bind gives you this kind of control. If the two blades meet with enough force to cut notches into each other, they will stick quite a bit at that point. So you can use that to control your opponent's blade, wrench it around, and make sure they can't immediately attack to another opening. The research on Bronze Age combat I mentioned earlier also seems to indicate that they use the swords this way to maintain edge contact until they're able to find a way to attack safely to an opponent's opening without leaving themselves exposed. And then you have to keep in mind that real-life combat doesn't neatly follow the rules. Even if the rules make perfect sense, and if you train using certain techniques because they're effective and because they keep you safe, that doesn't mean everything always went according to plan. There's, for example, what I like to call the oh shit parry, where something has gone wrong. Say your opponent has outmaneuvered you, and all you have time to do is just use your blade passively as a shield, and just to prevent yourself from getting cut. Because I'd rather take a notch in the blade than one in my head. For those last moment passive displacements, it can be more beneficial to catch it on the edge, because you simply have mechanically more resistance here. You can withstand more pressure in this direction than you can in that, because the wrist isn't as strong in this direction. So if somebody pushes here or here, this is going to be much harder for me to hold against than this way. But there are situations when you end up doing an oh shit parry with the flat. I've done that in sparring, where the only thing I could do last moment was basically to put the flat almost directly against my body and use it as sort of improvised armor almost. When I sift through the historical manuscripts, I keep finding examples of both edge and flat defenses. Oftentimes it's not specified, and with the active defenses, It really depends on the angle and the technique, but it's very common to see a counter hew that stops the opponent's blade by cutting against it, which, depending on the angle, can be either edge versus flat or edge versus edge at an angle. This is what you see quite often. This is really not an either or discussion. It's both, depending on the situation, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, whether you want to perform a deflectional parry or a hard block makes a huge difference for this. Depending on where you want the opponent to go. Do you want to obtain a bind or not? Insisting exclusively on either one or the other would limit options and impoverish the swordsmanship. Anyway, hope you found this interesting, and thanks for watching.